December 8, 1941, Rockport, Massachusetts. A cold Atlantic wind pushed across the empty streets as the sun dragged itself over the harbor, lighting the fishing boats tied tight against the docks. In the upstairs bedroom of a narrow blue house on Granite Street, 18-year-old Ralph Harrington sat at the edge of his bed, still wearing the suit he'd put on for school the day before. The radio on his dresser crackled with static, then settled into the grim, clipped voice of a War Department correspondent describing the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. Ralph leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tight the knuckles went white. He had listened to the broadcast 3 times already, but each time the words hit like new punches. Battleships burning, casualties mounting, a date which will live in infamy. His jaw worked without sound. Outside, someone slammed a screen door. A dog barked. Life went on, but for Ralph, and for the whole country, nothing was the same. He reached up and shut off the radio. The sudden silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like a pressure building inside his chest. Every boy at Rockport High had been talking about enlistment that morning, half of them bragging, the other half pretending not to be scared. Ralph wasn't bragging, and he wasn't scared. He was restless, like something inside him had already stepped forward. He stood, straightened his shirt, and walked downstairs. His mother was at the sink washing dishes, shoulders hunched, movements slow. His father sat at the table with the Gloucester Daily Times, the headline so large it seemed to swallow the whole page. His father didn't look up. "You're thinking about signing up?" Ralph stopped in the doorway. "Yes, sir." His mother froze, but didn't turn. The faucet kept running. "You finish school first," his father said. "That's what you can do for your country right now." Ralph nodded, though the answer didn't quiet the weight inside him. He had always known he'd join. He just didn't expect the choice to arrive in a single day, carried on smoke and tragedy from across the Pacific. February 1942, Boston Army Air Corps Recruiting Office. Snow clung to the edges of the sidewalk as Ralph stepped through the glass door of the recruiting station. Inside, the air smelled of ink, floor polish, and the wool of a dozen uniforms. Aviation Cadet posters lined the walls, smiling pilots in leather jackets, the gleaming nose of a fighter splitting through clouds. Above the desk hung a massive American flag. A sergeant behind the counter looked Ralph over and asked, "You here to take the test?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Pilot track?" "If I qualify." The sergeant cracked a grin. "Kid, everybody wants to fly. Let's see if you've got the head for it." Ralph followed him into a narrow room with a metal desk and a single overhead lamp. The Aviation Cadet entrance exam sat waiting. 150 questions. Math, mechanics, reasoning, aeronautic basics. He exhaled and started. For an hour he worked steadily, methodically, the scratch of his pencil the only sound in the room. When he handed the test over, his palms were damp. The sergeant scored it while Ralph pretended not to watch. The pencil paused. 110 correct. The sergeant whistled under his breath. "You just punched your ticket, son." Ralph's chest loosened. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the pressure inside him eased. But the sergeant wasn't done. "Physical exam next. If you pass that, you're cadet material." Ralph did. Height, weight, blood pressure, eyesight. The flight surgeon even tapped him on the knee and said, "Reflexes of a pilot." When it was over, Ralph stood outside the recruiting station with a manila envelope under his arm and the winter sun shining weakly across Boston Harbor. He felt taller, straighter, like the world had shifted again, this time in a direction he could run toward. June 29, 1942, Camp Devens, Massachusetts. 2 weeks after graduating from Rockport High, Ralph stepped off a bus onto the parade ground of Camp Devens, wearing the brand new uniform of an Aviation Cadet private. The air smelled of dust, diesel, and cut grass. Cadres shouted orders as new recruits shuffled into lines. Ralph scanned the crowd, hundreds of young men, all about his age, all wearing the same anxious determination he felt. A lieutenant strode out with a clipboard. "Listen up. You're being divided into 3 tracks: pilots, navigators, and bombardiers. Half of you will be pilot candidates." Ralph kept his face neutral, but his heart hammered. Names were called. Men stepped forward. Finally, "Harrington, Ralph L., pilot." Ralph inhaled sharply. The lieutenant's voice faded under the roar in his ears. Pilot. The word didn't feel real. Not yet. Around him, some men groaned, others cheered, others just swallowed hard. Ralph didn't react. He simply nodded once, quiet, steady, like a young man accepting not just an assignment, but a direction his life had already been pulling toward since the morning of December 8th. That evening, lying in a narrow bunk in a long wooden barracks, Ralph stared up at the rafters while the room buzzed with hushed excitement. Somewhere down the row, someone whispered about fighter wings. Another bragged about bombing Tokyo one day. Ralph said nothing. He just closed his eyes and pictured a cockpit. Sunlight on glass, engines hitting full power, a runway dropping away beneath him. Tomorrow, his training would begin. August 3rd, 1942, Maxwell Field, Montgomery, Alabama. The heat rose off the asphalt in shimmering waves as the bus doors scissored open, dumping 30 exhausted aviation cadets onto the parade square. Humidity wrapped around them like a wet blanket, and the smell of cut grass mixed with engine oil drifted across the training grounds. Over the din of idling trucks came the sharp bark of an upperclassman's voice. "Cadets, on the line, move!" Ralph Harrington hit the ground running, duffel bouncing against his hip. Sweat stung his eyes before he'd taken 5 steps. This wasn't Rockport anymore. This wasn't even Camp Devens. Maxwell Field was the crucible, where the U.S. Army Air Forces took civilians and stripped them down to the bones so they could rebuild them into pilots. Upperclassmen patrolled the line like wolves circling new prey. Their boots clicked with precision on the concrete as they stepped close, too close, eyes scanning uniforms for a loose thread, untucked corner, or any flaw that could be punished. A tall cadet with polished captain's bars, a thin mustache, and a voice that could split wood stopped in front of Ralph. "You, Cadet Harrington." Ralph snapped to attention. "Yes, sir." "How far is the sun from Earth?" "Approximately 93 million miles, sir." "How do you know that?" "High school astronomy, sir." The upperclassman leaned in until Ralph could smell his shaving cream. "You better hope your flying is as good as your guessing, cadet." He moved on. Ralph didn't breathe until the man's boots faded into the distance. The group was herded into a long wooden barracks, 2 narrow aisles, metal bunks stacked too high, footlockers lined with mathematical precision. A training sergeant tossed Ralph a folded sheet. "Top bunk, Harrington, and don't get comfortable. You won't be sleeping much." Ralph almost smiled. He wasn't here for rest. The next morning began at 04:30. A piercing trumpet blast jolted the entire row into motion. Men tumbled out of bunks, boots half-laced, shirts backward, grabbing for belts and caps. By 04:45, they were outside on the PT field, the Alabama sky still dark but already warm. "Double time, knees up." "Cadet, do you call that a push-up?" "Harrington, faster. Faster means now." Ralph's lungs burned, but there was a strange certainty anchoring him. This was what he'd signed up for. This was the path to the cockpit. Later that morning, they filed into a classroom building that looked more like a small college than a military base. Chalkboards, long wooden desks, ceiling fans spinning lazily. But any illusion of comfort evaporated when Captain Morgan, their pre-flight instructor, strode to the podium. "You are not pilots," Morgan said, voice smooth but hard. You are not even close. You are expected to fail. Most of you will." He paused, letting the weight settle in the room. "If you want to wear wings, you will memorize every bolt in a radial engine and every letter of the flight code. You will live with it, breathe it, sweat it. Understood?" A thunder of voices replied, "Yes, sir." The next weeks blurred into a relentless cycle of academics and stress drills. Aerodynamics in the morning, lift, drag, angle of attack, then aircraft identification, meteorology, radio procedures, even navigation mathematics. Afternoons were filled with calisthenics, obstacle courses, and confidence runs through mud pits that seemed specifically designed to steal shoes and dignity. Some nights, Ralph lay awake on his top bunk listening to men mutter in their sleep, their minds haunted by equations, checklists, or the booming voices of upperclassmen. Anxiety hung in the barracks like smoke. One evening, after lights out, a kid from Ohio sitting across the aisle whispered, "Harrington, you think you'll make it?" Ralph stared at the rafters. "I didn't come this far to quit." "Yeah, me neither," the kid said, but the tremble in his voice told another story. Cadets disappeared every week, washed out, reassigned, or simply unable to keep up. Each missing face was a reminder. The Air Corps didn't play favorites. Talent wasn't enough. You needed grit. In late September, Ralph moved from underclassmen to upperclassmen, a shift that felt like stepping from fog into clear air. Upperclassmen were still under enormous pressure, but now he was the one correcting uniforms, pushing men through drills, making sure nobody cracked under the strain of becoming a military aviator. One afternoon, he stood on the tarmac with his flight section when a Stearman PT-17 roared overhead, yellow wings catching the sun, engine buzzing like a furious hornet. The biplane dipped low, almost skimming the tree line, before rising gracefully and disappearing into the distance. The men around Ralph erupted with excitement. "That'll be us soon," someone whispered. Ralph watched the sky long after the others stopped. He could almost feel the control stick in his hand, almost hear the wind tearing past the canopy, almost see the world shrinking below him. Maxwell had pushed him, humbled him, sharpened him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had confirmed it. He was born to fly. October 12, 1942, Bennettsville, South Carolina. Dawn crept slowly over the flat farmland surrounding the civilian flying school, turning the hangars gold while the air still held the cool bite of night. A row of yellow Stearman PT-17 biplanes lined the grass runway like bright toy soldiers, their fabric wings catching the light as if they were eager to leap skyward. Ralph Harrington stepped out of the cadet barracks with his flight helmet in hand and a nervous energy buzzing in his chest. Maxwell Field had tested his mind and will. Bennettsville would test the one thing he'd been dreaming of since the day he signed his papers in Boston: his ability to fly. Across the field, an instructor strode toward the planes with the casual swagger of a man who had logged more hours in the sky than on the ground. Leather jacket open, goggles hanging around his neck, he didn't need to shout to command attention. "Cadets," he said, voice low and easy. "Today you stop imagining what flying feels like. Today, you find out." A ripple of electricity passed through the group. Men swallowed hard, traded nervous grins, adjusted their helmets. Ralph stayed quiet. His heartbeat thudded in his throat. The instructor pointed at the nearest PT-17. "Harrington, you're up first." Ralph blinked. "Yes, sir." He walked toward the biplane, boots crunching over dew-wet grass. The closer he got, the larger the aircraft felt. Not intimidating, but alive. The radial engine still smelled faintly of fuel and hot metal. He ran a hand along the lower wing. Canvas over wood. Simple, honest construction. Nothing like the gleaming twin-engine bombers he would one day fly. But it didn't need to be. The PT-17 existed for one purpose: to teach men whether they belonged in the sky. The instructor climbed into the rear cockpit. "Let's see what Maxwell put in your head. Get in." Ralph cinched himself into the front cockpit, pulled the lap belt tight, adjusted the headset, and took a long breath. "All right, Harrington, let's light this thing." He engaged the primer, set the mixture, pushed the throttle slightly forward. The instructor gave a thumbs up. Ralph hit the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, then burst awake in a roar that vibrated through his bones. The entire aircraft trembled like an animal eager to leap free. "Taxi!" the instructor shouted over the headset. Ralph eased the throttle and guided the steerman across the grass. The tailwheel bumped over ruts and dips, the rudder pedals alive under his feet. He focused on the yellow nose bobbing ahead of him, trying to ignore the rising buzz in his veins. When they reached the end of the field, the instructor tapped his shoulder. "Line her up, Harrington." Ralph centered the biplane on the makeshift runway. Wind brushed across his goggles. The world felt impossibly wide and impossibly close at the same time. "Full throttle." Ralph pushed the lever forward. The engine roared like it had been waiting for this moment. The steerman surged ahead. The grass blurred under the tires. The wings caught the rising wind. Ralph felt the tail lift. And suddenly the runway wasn't beneath him anymore. They were flying. Not high, not far, but flying. Air rushed around the open cockpit, tearing the breath from his lungs but filling his chest with something weightless. The ground fell away. The horizon tilted. His hands trembled on the stick, not from fear, from awe. For the first time, Ralph understood what the older pilots meant when they described flight as freedom. "Eyes up," the instructor barked. "Keep your wings level." Ralph adjusted. The plane responded immediately, light, obedient. "That's it. Now give me a gentle climb." The PT-17 rose toward the morning sky. Farms and dirt roads shrank below them into a patchwork of green and brown. Smoke curled from a lone farmhouse chimney. In the distance, the sun glinted off a slow-moving river. Ralph felt a smile pulling at his cheeks under the leather helmet. "Not bad for a Massachusetts kid," the instructor said. "Let's see some turns." They spent the next half hour banking, climbing, and descending across the Carolina countryside. Every movement became an unspoken dialogue between Ralph and the machine. The controls were light, but honest. If he overcorrected, they told him. If he relaxed, they told him. The aircraft didn't lie. Later, the instructor took control. "You've got the touch, Harrington, but don't get cocky. This little yellow bird forgives mistakes. The bigger ones won't." Ralph nodded. He knew. "Bring us home." The landing was rough, too high on approach, too slow in the flare. The plane thumped onto the grass harder than it should have. The instructor grunted, but didn't say anything until the engine was off. "You'll improve," he said simply. "Everybody does." Ralph climbed out, legs unsteady but heart steady. Steady in a way he hadn't felt before. He had touched the sky, and the sky had accepted him. By the end of the day, he would log 2 more flights. By the end of the week, acrobatics. By the end of 8 weeks, he'd know the PT-17 inside and out, from stall behavior to spin recovery. But that first flight, the moment the wheels left the ground, that was the moment Ralph Harrington became a pilot in his soul. December 2nd, 1942, Shaw Field, Sumter, South Carolina. Frost clung to the edges of the runway as the early morning sun crept over the pine forests surrounding Shaw Field. The air was colder here than in Bennettsville, the kind of sharp, biting chill that made breath hang in the air like smoke. Rows of BT-13 Vultee vibrators sat on the tarmac, their steel-gray skins glinting under the orange sky. Ralph Harrington tightened his flight jacket as he stepped from the barracks. The PT-17 had been cheerful, forgiving, almost playful. The BT-13 was none of those things. It was larger, heavier, louder, and entirely uninterested in making a pilot look good. Word among cadets was simple: if a man didn't wash out in primary, the BT-13 would finish the job. Ralph walked toward his assigned aircraft, goggles in hand, helmet tucked under his arm. The Vultee's wide propeller looked like a giant's axe, frozen mid-swing. An instructor, Lieutenant Barnes, a compact man with a gravelly voice and a permanent scowl, was already waiting. "You Harrington?" "Yes, sir." "You flew the Stearman clean?" "Yes, sir." Barnes grunted. "Good. Forget everything you learned. This isn't a toy. This one fights back." Ralph nodded, though his gut tightened. Shaw's reputation preceded it. Upperclassmen whispered that the BT-13 kicked like a mule in crosswinds and could rattle a man's teeth loose on landing. The instructor climbed into the rear cockpit. "Strap in. Let's see if you can handle something with metal on it." Ralph settled into the pilot's seat, cinched the harness, and checked the array of gauges: oil pressure, manifold pressure, RPM, fuel mixture. Much more to manage than the PT-17. He primed the engine, set the mixture, and hit the starter. The BT-13 came alive with a deep, throaty growl, its frame vibrating under him. The noise was nearly physical, pressing against his chest. "Taxi out," Barnes ordered. Ralph eased the throttle forward, guiding the Vultee along the concrete. It was heavier on the pedals, more stubborn in its turns. He felt every pound of it. They lined up on the runway. "Full power." Ralph pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared. The aircraft surged ahead. Unlike the PT-17, the BT-13 didn't skip across the ground. It clawed forward like it planned to tear the runway out of the earth. The tail lifted. Then the plane heaved itself into the sky. Not graceful, not gentle, but powerful. "Climb to 1,500 feet, Barnes said. Ralph pulled back on the stick. The Vultee climbed, engine hammering against the cold morning air. Shaw Field shrank below them, the hangars, the runway, the endless grid of barracks. At altitude, Barnes took the radio. "Try a shallow turn." Ralph banked left. The Vultee shuddered. "More rudder, more... There. Feel it?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Now steeper." Ralph increased the bank angle. The plane protested with a low, angry vibration. Barnes' voice crackled in his headset. "She'll tell you when she's unhappy. Listen to her." They spent the next hour practicing chandelles, stalls, and emergency procedures. Ralph learned quickly that the BT-13 had no tolerance for laziness. If his hands grew sloppy, the Vultee bucked. If he misjudged a stall, the nose dropped like a stone. He didn't master the aircraft that first day, but he survived it, and that meant something. In the following weeks, Shaw Field swallowed weaker men whole. The washout rate climbed. Every morning, Ralph saw empty bunks where cadets had slept the night before. Men reassigned to navigation, bombardier training, or worse, discharged outright. But Ralph kept going. He studied late into the night, drilling emergency procedures until he could recite them in his sleep. He practiced landings until his arms throbbed from fighting the Vultee's stubborn controls. He woke before reveille and jogged the perimeter of the field, lungs burning in the cold. One evening, after a particularly brutal crosswind landing session, Barnes walked beside Ralph on the tarmac. "You're stiff," Barnes said. "Yes, sir." "You're overthinking it." "Yes, sir." Barnes stopped, turned, and poked a finger at Ralph's chest. "Flying isn't math, it's instinct. Feel the plane. Don't fight it unless it fights you first." Ralph hesitated, then asked, "Sir, did you lose pilots to this thing?" Barnes' jaw tensed. "Every base did." but it teaches lessons nothing else can. Men who master the BT-13 can fly damn near anything. Ralph nodded. He didn't just want to pass. He wanted to earn that confidence. By early 1943, Ralph's class shifted into upperclassman phase. He walked differently now, shoulders squared, steps steady. Shaw had carved away any softness left in him. One crisp morning, after a flawless series of loops and stall recoveries, Barnes spoke through the headset. "Bring us back, Harrington." Ralph lined up the approach. The Vultee dropped toward the runway, steady, obedient. He flared at the perfect moment, wheels kissing the ground with a smoothness that surprised even him. When the engine finally shut down, Barnes climbed out, slapped the fuselage twice and said, "You'll make a fine officer." It was the closest thing to praise the man had ever given. That night, in the dim barracks light, Ralph stared at his newly issued Aviation Cadet ID card, Class 43-I, September graduation. He had made it through basic. He had earned his place. And tomorrow, his journey would move to Turner Field, toward twin engines, heavier aircraft, and closer steps to war. But for now, he allowed himself one quiet moment. Outside, a BT-13 engine roared as another cadet trained late. Ralph smiled. He no longer feared that sound. He understood it. February 7, 1943. Turner Field, Albany, Georgia. Rain hammered the tin roof of the hangar like a drum line gone mad, echoing across the wide-open flight yard where rows of twin-engine trainers sat glistening under gray skies. The air smelled of wet concrete, engine oil, and the lingering burn of avgas. The AT-10 Wichita and AT-9 Jeep, sleek, angular, and far less forgiving than anything Ralph Harrington had flown before, waited like steel predators, ready to judge every mistake a cadet might dare to make. Ralph stepped out of the barracks with his flight bag slung over his shoulder. The cold rain soaked instantly into his jacket. Turner Field was notorious. If Shaw had carved the boys down to serious aviators, Turner took those aviators and decided which ones deserved real wings, and which ones would be sent home with silent handshakes and lowered eyes. He reached Hangar 3, boots splashing through puddles, and found Captain Roger Cochran already waiting beside an AT-10 with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Cochran was tall, broad-shouldered, his expression carved from granite, but his eyes, sharp, blue, and unblinking, held a calculating intelligence that made most cadets straighten their posture instinctively. "Harrington," Cochran said without looking up. "You ready for two engines?" "Yes, sir." "We'll find out." The captain slapped the fuselage. "Get in." The AT-10's cockpit was cramped but purposeful. 2 seats, 2 yokes, a forest of gauges, and twice the responsibility Ralph had ever carried. He strapped in, inhaling the smell of oiled metal and canvas, and ran through the checklist. Fuel on. Mixture rich. Magnetos both. Props set. Cochran nodded once. "Start engines." Ralph hit the starter switches. The left engine coughed, then roared to life with a violent shudder that rattled the cockpit. The right engine came alive a heartbeat later. Ralph felt the power of the twin props through the seat, through the pedals, through his bones. This wasn't the twitchy PT-17 or the stubborn BT-13. This was something else, something that demanded respect. "Taxi us out," Cochran ordered. Ralph rolled the AT-10 forward. It felt heavy, deliberate, but smoother than expected. The rain streaked across the canopy as he guided the plane toward the runway. His hands were steady, though his pulse beat fast in his neck. They lined up on the tarmac. Rain blurred the horizon. "Full power!" Ralph pushed the throttles forward. The engines screamed. The plane lurched ahead, gaining speed, wheels pounding across the water-slick runway. "Keep it straight," Cochran warned. Ralph fought the crosswind. The nose lifted. The runway dropped away. They were airborne. The AT-10 climbed through the clouds like a beast waking from hibernation. Ralph kept his grip firm on the yoke, eyes scanning the gauges, RPM, manifold pressure, cylinder head temp, artificial horizon. "Balance your power," Cochrane said over the intercom. "Twin engines don't forgive sloppy hands." Ralph adjusted the throttles. The aircraft steadied. For the next hour, they practiced climbs, banks, engine-out procedures, and stalls. With two engines, everything mattered more. If he pulled too hard, the nose snapped. If his feet got lazy on the rudder, the plane yawed like a tugboat in a storm. If he mismanaged power, the aircraft reminded him with a violent jolt. Ralph didn't enjoy it, not at first. He survived it, and that was step one. 2 weeks later, the real test arrived. Cochrane stood beside a row of AT-9 Jeep trainers, the unforgiving, sharp-nosed twin-engine aircraft designed to mimic the handling of real combat planes. "This," Cochrane said, tapping the metal skin, "is the meanest little bastard in the Army Air Forces. She'll spin if you look at her wrong. She'll bite if you're slow. She'll kill you if you're stupid." Rain dripped from the captain's cap brim. "Mount up." Ralph climbed into the cockpit. The AT-9 felt tighter, twitchier, more predatory than the AT-10. The controls were heavier, the visibility worse, the margin for error razor thin. Engine start, taxi, run up, take off. The AT-9 jumped into the air like it was angry. Within minutes, Ralph understood why this aircraft washed out so many cadets. The controls were hyper-responsive, but unforgiving. A shallow turn became steep in the blink of an eye. Trim wrong by a hair, and the plane drifted like a drunken boxer. A stall wasn't a gentle nod, it was a snap that threatened to fling him sideways into the ground. Halfway through the flight, Cochrane cut the left engine without warning. The aircraft lurched, hard. Ralph fought the yoke, shoved rudder, adjusted throttle, stabilized. "Good," Cochrane said calmly. "Most cadets panic." Ralph didn't feel proud. He just felt the sweat running down his spine. But by the end of the 2-week AT-9 phase, something inside him had shifted. The mental strain, the constant balancing act, the precision, it all began to click. He moved with the aircraft now, not against it. On the final check ride, Cochrane stepped out of the plane, scribbled something on his clipboard, and looked at Ralph with a rare half-smile. "You'll be flying combat bombers," he said. "Men like you don't wash out." And on a crisp October morning in 1943, Ralph Harrington stood on the Turner Field parade ground, wings glinting on his chest, commission orders in hand. He was an officer now, a pilot, 20 years old and ready for whatever came next. But nothing, not Maxwell, not Bennettsville, not Shaw, not Turner, had prepared him for Dodge City, where the B-26 Marauder waited. November 18, 1943, Dodge City Army Air Base, Kansas. The Kansas wind cut across the open plains like a dull knife as Ralph Harrington stepped off the transport truck and onto the wide concrete apron of the Dodge City training base. The sky above was a bright, relentless blue, so wide it felt like it could swallow a man whole. But it wasn't the sky that held Ralph's attention. It was the bomber. The B-26 Marauder sat at the far end of the field, engine silent, nose slightly lowered, as if studying the new pilots who dared approach it. Sleek lines, narrow wings, twin engines that looked too powerful for their own good. The whole aircraft radiated menace and promise. It was faster, heavier, and far less forgiving than the training planes that came before it. Men whispered about it in the barracks. One a day in Tampa Bay. The Widowmaker. The flying prostitute, no visible means of support. But Ralph didn't see danger at first glance. He saw destiny. A captain in a leather jacket approached with a clipboard and a cigarette hanging from his lip. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw square. "Listen up," he barked. "I'm Captain Cochran, your instructor for this phase. If you're here, it means the Air Corps thinks you might be good enough to fly the Marauder. That doesn't mean you are good enough. We'll find out." His eyes swept the group like a searchlight. "The B-26 doesn't tolerate fear. It doesn't tolerate hesitation. If you hesitate, you die. If you listen, you live." A few men swallowed hard. One shifted nervously. Ralph stood still. Cochran blew out a stream of smoke. "Mount up. I want Harrington in my section." The cockpit of the B-26 was the largest Ralph had ever seen, yet somehow it felt tighter, more intimate. 2 high-backed pilot seats, banks of gauges, twin throttles, hydraulic levers, prop controls, fuel selectors, and more switches than he'd ever imagined crammed into one space. It wasn't simply flying now, it was management, systems, power, precision. "You're co-pilot today," Cochran said, sliding into the left seat. "Tomorrow you'll take the stick, but first, you'll learn to respect this beast." Ralph strapped in. The bomber smelled of leather, oil, and metal warmed by the Kansas sun. He ran his hands across the yoke, sturdy, slightly worn. "Checklist," Cochran ordered. Ralph recited. "Battery on, boost pumps on, fuel selectors to main, props full forward, mixture rich." Cochran cracked a grin. "You might just make it." He signaled the ground crew. "Clear props." Ralph hit the starter. The left engine ignited with a roar that rolled through his chest. The plane shuddered like something alive fighting its restraints. The right engine followed, 2 massive radial hearts pounding in perfect, terrifying rhythm. The B-26 was awake. They taxied to the runway, nose dipping with each bump, engines humming at low idle. Ralph felt the nerves tighten in his throat, but he held steady. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Cochran throttled up. The Marauder surged forward. Ralph felt the weight, 13 tons of machinery accelerating across the concrete. The narrow wings bit into the air, and the bomber lifted, climbing hard into the Kansas sky. "Hold us steady," Cochran said. Ralph watched every gauge: manifold pressure, cylinder head temp, airspeed, trim. The B-26 responded sharply, almost eagerly, but not kindly. It demanded respect, demanded precision. This plane wasn't a teacher. It was an executioner. And a rewarder, if you earned it. Over the next 40 minutes, Cochran put Ralph through the ringer. "Bank left, right, nose down, more than that, not so much. Feel the stall. You feel it? Good. Recover. Engine out drill, now." Ralph shoved the throttles, corrected yaw, adjusted trim, hands and feet moving without hesitation. The bomber bucked, growled, fought him, but he fought back. After a particularly rough maneuver, Cochran grunted. "Most cadets cry the first week." Ralph wiped sweat from his brow. "Yes, sir." "You're allowed to," Cochran added casually, "but not today." That afternoon, Ralph moved from co-pilot to pilot. His hands were steady on the yoke. The B-26 climbed under his command, engines roaring against the huge blue Kansas sky. He felt the weight, the power, the responsibility. But he also felt something else. He belonged here. Later in the week came crew integration, 6 men working together: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, gunners. Ralph learned to coordinate, to command, to trust, and be trusted. And then came the scare tactics. Instructors gathered the group and deadpanned, "If one engine quits on takeoff, the B-26 flips over and kills everyone." Half the cadets turned pale. One nearly fainted. Ralph studied Cochrane's expression. It was a lie, a test. Cochrane caught Ralph's eye and smirked. "Good," he muttered quietly. "You think before you panic." By mid-January 1944, the class thinned. Men washed out, redirected to cargo planes or ground duty. But Ralph remained, sharper, harder, more confident, but not arrogant. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the plains, Cochrane approached Ralph near Hangar 6. "Harrington," he said, lighting a cigarette, "you're not just going to make it, you're going to be good." Ralph nodded. "Yes, sir." "You're ready for assignment." Assignment meant graduation. Assignment meant deployment. Assignment meant war. The next morning, orders arrived. Second Lieutenant Ralph L. Harrington, 22nd Tow Target Squadron, Delhart, Texas. Not combat yet, but a step closer. And soon, very soon, Italy, the 15th Air Force, and the skies over Europe would call his name. March 3, 1944, Delhart Army Air Base, Texas. Dust swirled in long, tan ribbons across the barren field as the morning sun climbed above the horizon. The 22nd Tow Target Squadron's hangars stood like weather-beaten sentinels, their metal siding rattling under the steady assault of prairie wind. Ralph Harrington walked across the tarmac toward his B-26, boots crunching through gravel, flight bag slung over his shoulder. He was a Marauder pilot now, one of the few who made it through Dodge City's crucible. But Delhart wasn't glamorous. It was repetitive, grueling, necessary. Tow target work meant long flights dragging canvas sleeves for gunners to practice tracking and firing, hours of steady formation flying, engine checks, and precise control inputs. It wasn't combat, but it created combat pilots. And Ralph treated every hour in the air as sharpening for the day he would need everything he knew. On his fourth week, a dust-covered sergeant sprinted toward him, shouting over the wind, "Lieutenant Harrington! Orders from Sioux City!" Ralph stopped dead. Sioux City wasn't another training base. It was a staging point. It meant one thing: deployment. March 21, 1944. Sioux City, Iowa. Snow drifted along the edges of the runway as 4 B-26s arrived from Delhart. The northern cold was a rude slap after Texas, but Ralph hardly felt it. He had been assigned as first pilot in the Tow Target Squadron detachment here. His own aircraft, his own crew, his own tiny slice of responsibility. The hangar at the southern end of the field became home. Long hours of maintenance, endless briefings, simulator drills, cross-training on the B-17 because the 15th Air Force needed bomber pilots, and needed them now. Ralph learned quickly that the B-17 was different. Slower to respond than the B-26, heavier on the controls. A floating fortress instead of a striking fist. But he adapted, smoothly. Sioux City wasn't meant to shape him. It was meant to test him. And he passed. By early spring, he was sent to Lincoln, Nebraska for one final week of preparation. Then the orders came through. Co-pilot assignment, 15th Air Force, Foggia Airfield Complex, Italy. Ralph folded the orders quietly. This was what every step of the past 2 years had been leading toward. He was going to war. April 15, 1944. Foggia, Italy. The C-47 transport jolted violently as it descended through rough Mediterranean winds. Ralph gripped the seat frame, trying to steady his breathing. Through the open cargo door, he saw the plains of southern Italy spread out below. Brown fields, farms, stone villages, and, in the distance, the faint silhouettes of the Apennine Mountains. As they touched down, dust billowed across the strip. The noise was overwhelming. Engines screaming, wrenches clanking, men shouting orders in a half-dozen accents. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses lined the airfield, their aluminum skins scuffed and smoke-stained, evidence of the missions they survived. A major met him on the flight line. "You Harrington?" "Yes, sir." "Welcome to the 15th Air Force. You're late," the major said without looking up. "Briefing in 10 minutes. First mission tomorrow." Ralph blinked. "Tomorrow, sir?" "You think we brought you to Italy for the wine?" The major walked off. Ralph hurried after him. April 16, 1944, pre-dawn, Foggia No. 3 Airfield. The briefing tent stank of mud, coffee, and fear. A map of Europe stretched across the back wall, arrows pointing north toward Linz, Vienna, Munich, and deep into the heart of Germany. Target, Augsburg, Aircraft Assembly Works, heavy flak expected, fighter resistance likely. The colonel tapped the map with a long wooden pointer. "Do not drop unless you have visual. Intel reports an extermination camp in the vicinity. No accidental releases. Understood?" A murmur of voices. "Yes, sir." Ralph swallowed hard. So this was war. When the briefing ended, crews filed out silently, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. They moved like men marching into a storm they couldn't avoid. Ralph climbed into his assigned B-17, sliding into the right-hand seat. The cockpit smelled of sweat, gun oil, and the faint metallic tang of spent shells. The pilot, a calm, square-jawed captain named Morris, gave him a nod. "Let's see what you're made of, Harrington." The takeoff was rough, the climb worse. The wind over the Alps slapped the bomber hard enough to send tremors through the control columns. Ralph steadied the gauges, airspeed, altitude, manifold pressure, all while scanning the sky. When the first bursts of black flak blossomed around them like poisonous flowers, he felt his throat constrict. Shrapnel tore through the wing. The radio operator shouted something. Morris cursed and shoved the yoke forward. Ralph fought to keep the plane steady as the formation tightened into a defensive box. They reached Augsburg. Smoke shrouded the city below, fires burning across streets and industrial yards. "Bomb bay doors open," Morris ordered. The cold wind howled through the fuselage. The bombardier hesitated. "No clear sighting, no drop." They made a second pass. A third. On the fourth, a gap in the haze revealed the target. "Bombs away!" The bomber lurched upward as the payload released. Then came the chaos. Flak slammed the belly. A shell tore through the radio compartment. The left inboard engine sputtered, then caught again. Gunfire rattled from the top turret as German fighters streaked past. By the time they limped home, the B-17 was a wounded animal, riddled with 118 holes. Ralph stepped onto the tarmac, legs weak, hands trembling. He'd flown through hell and survived. And the grim knowledge settled into him like a cold stone. Only 16 missions remained. 16 more times flying into the teeth of the enemy. He wasn't the same young man who once grinned at a PT-17 under a South Carolina sunrise. War had changed him, quickly, permanently. And ahead lay Munich, Vienna, Linz, Yugoslavia, and the Alps. Always the Alps, towering like silent judges above every mission. This was the life of a bomber pilot in the 15th Air Force. And Ralph Harrington was in it now, heart, hands, and fate.